They gave the problem to a man of rank, and he answered with brute force. He failed. They watched a woman of no station, and she answered with numbers and stone. She succeeded. Before they knew her name was a legend, they only knew the silence that followed the single shot that traveled 4,000 meters to teach a master sergeant the difference between authority and power. The silence in the Coast Pactia Pass was a physical entity. It had weight, pressing down on the sun-baked rock and the corrugated steel of Forward Operating Base Sentinel. It was a silence composed not of peace, but of anticipation. It seeped into the marrow, a low-frequency hum of dread that vibrated just beneath the threshold of hearing. The air itself, thin and sharp at 9,000 feet, tasted of granite dust, diesel fumes, and fear. Corporal Eva Rostova tasted it on her tongue, catalogued it, filed it away. The dust was primarily feldspar and mica schist. Its specific gravity, a known variable. The diesel was F24, its evaporative rate a function of the barometric pressure, which was currently 724 hectopascals and falling. The fear was an intangible, yet she could almost quantify it in the subtle tremor of a sentry's hands, the too quick dart of his eyes across the ridgeline. Fear altered respiration, which altered the carbon dioxide content of the immediate air, which, in microscopic ways, altered light refraction. Everything was data. She sat away from the others, on the shaded side of a gabion barrier, her back pressed against the wire mesh and packed earth. She was not cleaning a weapon or field stripping a radio. Her hands moved with a surgeon's delicacy over the worn leather cover of a notebook, its pages filled not with letters home, but with differential equations, Winrow's diagrams, and intricate geological cross-sections of the surrounding peaks. Beside her, mounted on a compact tripod, was not a rifle scope, but a thermographic spotting scope linked to a small, ruggedized tablet. On its screen, the mountains were rendered in a ghostly palette of oranges, blues, and purples, a landscape of pure thermal energy. She was watching the temperature gradients shift as the morning sun climbed, observing the way the cold air pooled in the ravines like liquid nitrogen, while the high ridges bled heat into the upper atmosphere. This was her battlefield, not the one of pockmarked earth and spent brass, but the one of invisible forces, of gravity, of wind shear, of the planet's own ponderous rotation. Her appearance was a study in non-regulation anonymity. She wore standard-issue fatigues, but they were sun-faded and devoid of rank or unit patches, as if she had been deliberately scrubbed of identity. Her hair was a severe dark knot at the nape of her neck. Her face was sharp angles and quiet intensity. Her eyes the color of a winter sky, constantly scanning, analyzing, processing. To the men of Sentinel, she was an anomaly, a ghost who had arrived 2 weeks prior on a blacked-out Pavlo helicopter with no explanation. They called her the Rock Watcher or the Weather Witch. She did not speak unless spoken to, and her replies were so clipped and precise they discouraged further conversation. She was a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of military order, and it made them uneasy. The source of their fear, the reason for the oppressive silence, had a name: the Ghost, an enemy sniper of preternatural skill. For 3 weeks he had haunted the passes, his rifle speaking in a single, fatal syllable from impossible distances. He never fired twice from the same position. His targets were chosen with chilling precision, always key personnel: a radio operator, a medic, an engineer. He was a phantom who left no trace but a fallen soldier and a ripple of terror. All attempts to locate him had failed. Drone surveillance saw nothing. Acoustic sensors gave baffling, contradictory reports. Counter-sniper teams sent into the mountains were themselves hunted, their own expert spotters falling victim to a marksman who seemed to command the very landscape. The screen door of the command tent groaned open, and the silence was violently torn apart. Master Sergeant Thorne emerged, blinking in the harsh sunlight. He was a man built of compressed anger and thick muscle, his neck as wide as another man's thigh. His voice, when it came, was a blunt instrument, designed to hammer lesser men into compliance. "Briefing now, move it!" he roared, the sound bouncing flatly off the nearby blast walls. Men scrambled from whatever shade they could find, their movements hurried and anxious. Thorne was a product of a different war, a war of kicking down doors and overwhelming force. This invisible enemy, this patient, methodical killer, was an affront to his entire worldview. He saw the problem not as a complex equation to be solved, but as a nail to be hammered, and he was the biggest hammer in the box. Ava closed her notebook, her movements unhurried. She disconnected the tablet and slid it into a padded pouch on her webbing. She did not rush. Her pulse remained a steady 62 beats per minute. Panic was a failure of imagination, a surrender to incomplete data. She had learned long ago that the universe was a place of cold, hard rules. Understand the rules, and you could bend them. Ignore them, and they would break you. Thorne, she had calculated, was a man on the verge of being broken. She walked toward the command tent, a small, quiet figure in the swirling dust, her mind already calculating the probability curves of the confrontation she knew was coming. The atmospheric pressure was still dropping. A storm was on its way. Inside the tent, the air was thick with the smell of sweat and stale coffee. A large flat-screen monitor dominated one wall, displaying a topographical map of the region, littered with red icons marking the ghost's kills. Thorne stood before it, his hands planted on his hips, his jaw set like a concrete block. He radiated a furious energy that made the air crackle. The men of the platoon crowded in, their faces grim. Thorne let the silence stretch, a crude tool of intimidation. He scanned their faces, his eyes finally landing on Eva, who stood near the back, her expression unreadable. "All right," Thorne began, his voice a low growl. "Command is screaming. The brass wants this ghost put in the ground. Yesterday." He jabbed a thick finger at the map. "Intel is useless. All we know is he's somewhere in this 10-click circle of hell." He paced back and forth, a caged predator. "Standard counter-sniper ops have failed. Why? Because we've been playing his game, sitting back, waiting, reacting." His voice rose in volume, a crescendo of frustration. "That ends today. We are done reacting. We are going to make this son of a bitch react to us." He slapped the map. "Here," he said, indicating a narrow, winding canyon known as the Serpent's Tooth. "This is the most likely avenue of approach for his resupply. It offers the best cover and concealment. The last 3 hits were all within a 4-click radius of this point." He outlined his plan. It was a classic Thorne solution. Simple, direct, and brutally aggressive. 2 fire teams would advance up the canyon, acting as a beater element, deliberately making noise and drawing attention. A 3rd team, a designated marksman unit, would set up an overwatch position on a ridge he had pre-selected, ready to engage the ghost when he was flushed out. "We go loud, we go hard, we pin him down with overwhelming fire, and we vaporize him." A young lieutenant, fresh out of training and clearly intimidated by Thorne, cleared his throat. "Master Sergeant, With respect, every acoustic triangulation we've run on the ghost's shots has been inconclusive. The sound seems to be coming from multiple places at once. If we commit to the serpent's tooth, we could be walking into a trap. Thorn rounded on him. Inconclusive? You know what's inconclusive, Lieutenant. Sitting back here on our asses waiting for another one of our boys to get a third eye put in him. The acoustic sensors are getting ghost echoes off these damn rocks. It's useless tech out here. My gut tells me he's in that canyon, and my gut has kept me alive a lot longer than some fancy microphone. His gaze swept the room, daring anyone else to challenge him. It was a performance of dominance, a display meant to quell dissent through sheer force of will. He was asserting the primacy of experience over data, of instinct over analysis. It was then that Ava spoke. Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the tension in the tent like a shard of glass. The sound isn't an echo. Every head turned toward her. The sudden focus of attention did not seem to register on her face. She looked directly at the map, not at Thorn. Thorn's eyes narrowed. He took a slow step toward her, his posture swelling with indignation. He saw her not as a soldier, but as an academic curiosity, a civilian scientist playing dress-up, and her contradiction was an intolerable act of insubordination. He had tolerated her presence, her strange instruments and silent observations, as some bizarre requirement from a higher echelon he didn't understand. But now she had crossed a line. She had questioned his authority in front of his men. "What did you say, Corporal?" His use of the rank was a deliberate insult, a reminder of her perceived place in the rigid hierarchy. "It's not an echo," she repeated, her tone flat and clinical, as if describing a rock sample. "It's acoustic mirroring. The primary sound wave from the shot is being deliberately reflected off a concave rock face. Based on the geological composition of this region, specifically the high-density metamorphic schist on Mount Jin, a formation like that would act as a parabolic reflector. It would refocus the sound, making it appear to originate from a point several kilometers from the actual shooter." She pointed a slender finger at a completely different part of the map, a desolate peak far to the east of the serpent's tooth. "The sound is coming from here. The shot is coming from somewhere else entirely." A wave of confused murmuring went through the platoon. They didn't understand the terms, but they understood she was telling Thorn he was fundamentally wrong. Thorn's face darkened to a deep, dangerous red. He saw her explanation not as a valid tactical theory, but as a personal attack, an attempt to undermine him with jargon and pseudoscience. "Acoustic mirroring," he sneered, the words dripping with contempt. "Is that what they're teaching you kids in basic now? You've been out here 2 weeks staring at rocks, and now you're a physics expert? I've been fighting in mountains like these since you were in diapers. It's called an echo. Sound bounces. Simple." "It's not simple," Eva countered, her voice still infuriatingly calm. "An echo is a degraded, delayed reflection. This is a coherent, focused wave. The ghost is using the terrain as a weapon to misdirect your sensors and your senses. He understands the environment in a way we have not yet accounted for." Thorn stepped closer until he was looming over her, a mountain of a man trying to intimidate a stone. "And I suppose your little tablet told you all this? You think this war is going to be won with a damn science project?" He jabbed his finger toward her, then toward the men. "This is a war won with blood and guts and trigger time. We need shooters, Corporal, not geologists. Your theory is garbage. You know nothing about real combat." the air in the tent grew thick and suffocating. The men watched, frozen, as the master sergeant, a figure of absolute authority in their world, publicly berated the quiet woman who had become the camp's resident enigma. They saw a clash of two irreconcilable worlds, the old guard of instinct and aggression versus a new breed of cold, data-driven warfare. Eva did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked past Thorn, her gaze fixed on the red icons that marked their dead on the map. Her response, when it came, was not an argument or a defense. It was a quiet, devastatingly precise prophecy. "Your plan will commit 3 fire teams to the Serpent's Tooth Canyon," she stated, her voice devoid of any emotion. "The ghost is not there. He is most likely in an elevated hide, observing that canyon. The thermal updrafts from the canyon floor, which will begin in approximately 70 minutes, will create a significant vertical mirage, distorting his target image. However, the crosswind flowing down from the Jin Massif will be laminar and predictable at his altitude. He will wait for your men to enter the kill zone, a 300-meter stretch of exposed shale halfway up the canyon. He will target your radio man first, then your medic. Your Overwatch team will not have a clear line of sight due to the curvature of the Western Canyon wall. You will lose 2 more men, and you will not see where the shot came from." Silence. It was no longer a disagreement. It was a direct, public refutation of his leadership, his experience, and his intelligence. She hadn't just questioned his plan. She had dissected it, laid it bare as a fatal error, and predicted its consequences with the chilling certainty of a coroner. Thorn's jaw worked, but no words came out for a moment. He was shaking with a rage so profound it was almost silent. He had expected her to back down, to be cowed by his rank and fury. Instead, she had delivered a verdict. When he finally found his voice, it was a low, venomous hiss. "You are relieved of all duties, Corporal. You will be confined to this base. You will not touch a radio, a weapon, or a piece of your ridiculous equipment until I get back. Is that understood?" "Yes, Master Sergeant," Eva replied. Her eyes never left the map. "Good," Thorn spat. He turned to the rest of the platoon, his face a mask of fury. "Gear up. We're moving out in 5. He stormed out of the tent, leaving a wake of stunned silence. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They had just witnessed something far more significant than a dressing down. They had witnessed a schism, a crack in the very foundation of their chain of command. They filed out of the tent, their boots crunching on the gravel, the master sergeant's angry certainty warring with the quiet woman's terrifyingly specific prediction. Eva remained alone in the tent, watching the blinking cursor on the digital map, her mind a silent whirlwind of calculations. The temperature was rising, the wind was shifting, the clock was ticking. 68 minutes later, the first crack of the rifle shot echoed through the pass. It was a sound Eva had already heard 1,000 times in her simulations, a dry, sharp report that was instantly swallowed by the vastness of the mountains. It was followed, a heartbeat later, by a distorted, booming report from the direction of Mount Jin, the perfect acoustic mirror she had predicted. Then, the radio, which had been left on in the command tent, erupted in a spray of static and panicked shouting. "Contact! Contact! Man down! Garcia's hit! Medic!" Eva stood perfectly still, listening. She closed her eyes, filtering out the fear in the voices, focusing only on the data. The time between the initial, faint shot and the panicked call. The direction of the reflected sound. the cadence of the background rifle fire as Thorne's men began shooting wildly at the rock face of Mount Jin, exactly where the sound seemed to have originated. They were firing at a ghost, wasting ammunition on a geological illusion. Another voice, breathless and strained, cut through the chaos. "Medic is down! I repeat, Doc is down! We're pinned! We can't see him! We can't see where it's coming from!" Two men, the radio man and the medic, just as she had said. A cold knot tightened in Ava's stomach. It was not satisfaction. It was the bitter, metallic taste of being right when the cost was measured in blood. The shouting on the radio devolved into a desperate stream of profanity and confusion. Thorne's voice was a hoarse, ragged roar, ordering suppressive fire on a target that wasn't there. His plan had not just failed, it had disintegrated into a catastrophe. His orthodoxy, his reliance on gut instinct and brute force, had led his men into a perfectly designed trap. The system was broken. The leader had failed. The crisis was absolute. The tent flap was thrown open. Corporal Davies, a young spotter from the Overwatch team, stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning comprehension. He had been in the briefing. He had heard her prediction. Now he was hearing it come true over the radio. "He's slaughtering them," Davies breathed, his voice shaking. "Thorne is just screaming at them to shoot at the wrong mountain." Eva opened her eyes. Her period of forced inaction was over. Thorne's authority had been nullified by his own failure. In the vacuum of leadership, only one thing mattered now: competence. She moved with an economy of motion that was almost unnerving. She walked past Davies, out of the tent and into the harsh sunlight. The distant, sporadic crackle of gunfire underscored the tension. The entire FOB was in a state of paralysis, soldiers taking cover, unsure of where the threat was, listening to the death of their comrades over the comms. She did not run. She walked directly to the large, hardened case that had been stored in the corner of the armory, a case no one but her was authorized to touch. She unfastened the clasps. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was not a standard-issue M24 or a Barrett. It was a fluid-looking piece of advanced engineering, its composite stock and fluted barrel looking more like something from a science fiction film than a battlefield. It was a custom-built, heavily modified .408 Chaytak intervention rifle. Her rifle. She lifted the 10-kilogram weapon as if it were weightless, her movements practiced and sure. Davies followed her, his own rifle held uselessly in his hands. "What are you doing?" Thorne said. "Thorne's orders are irrelevant," Eva stated, her voice cutting through his protest. She didn't look at him. She was already scanning the ridgelines, her eyes moving, calculating, discarding possibilities. The situation has changed. His command has failed to preserve the lives of his men. A new tactical solution is required. Authority did not need to be seized. In a moment of true crisis, it simply flowed to the calmest, most competent person in the room, or in this case, on the fire base. She walked to the highest point of the perimeter, a sandbagged emplacement that offered the widest field of view. She laid the rifle on its bipod, the movement smooth and precise. She wasn't just a soldier with a gun. She was a master craftsman with her chosen instrument. "Davies," she said, her voice sharp, pulling him from his stunned inaction. "I need a spotter, not for the target, for the environment. Can you do that?" The request was a test. She was asking him to publicly defy the master sergeant, to abandon the crumbling chain of command and align himself with her. Davies looked from Eva's calm, focused face toward the canyon where his friends were being systematically eliminated. He saw Thorne's failed aggression on one side and Eva's cold, analytical promise of a solution on the other. The choice was clear. "Yes, Corporal," he said, the word firm. He dropped to his stomach beside her, pulling out his own high-powered spotting scope and a Kestrel wind meter. He had made his decision. He was following logic, not rank. Thorne's voice, raw with fury and impotence, crackled over Davies's radio. "Davies, what the hell are you doing? Get your weapon pointed at Jin. That's an order." Eva didn't even glance at the radio. "Ignore him," she said. "Give me wind speed and direction at your position." Davies hesitated for a fraction of a second, then turned off his radio. He had crossed the Rubicon. "Wind is 3.5 meters per second, bearing 290. "As expected," Eva murmured, her eye already pressed to the massive optic on her rifle. "That's ground wind. We need to calculate the wind columns at 400, 1,000, and 2,000 meters. The valley air is heating, creating a vertical shear. The wind up there is doing something completely different." She began issuing a string of commands, her voice a calm, hypnotic metronome against the backdrop of distant chaos. "Get the thermal imager. Point it at the eastern face of the Wyvern's tooth massif. Find me the inversion layer. It will look like a horizontal ripple, a seam in the air." Davies scrambled to obey, connecting her tablet to his scope. He was now her hands, her assistant in a complex, deadly scientific experiment. I think I have it. Around 3,000 meters up?" "That's it," Eva confirmed. She was inputting data into a ballistic computer built into the rifle's stock. Air temperature at our altitude is 19 degrees Celsius. Humidity is 12%. Barometric pressure is 722 hectopascals. The inversion layer will be colder, denser. The bullet will cross that boundary. We have to account for the change in drag coefficient. Her monologue was not for Davies. It was for herself, a verbal checklist of the dozens of variables she was juggling in her mind. The target is approximately 4,150 meters from our position. At that range, the Coriolis effect is a significant factor. The rotation of the Earth will cause the bullet to drift to the right. I'm calculating a drift of 2.8 meters. She adjusted a dial on her scope. Spin drift from the bullet's own rotation will add another meter of rightward movement. More adjustments. The wind is the real problem. There are at least 3 distinct wind vectors between here and the target. The ground wind is from the west. The mid-level wind, deflected by the Jin Massif, will be from the northeast. The high-altitude jet stream is pushing east. Davies stared at her, dumbfounded. He was a trained spotter. He knew about wind calls and leading a target. What she was describing was on another level entirely. It was 4-dimensional physics, a problem of unimaginable complexity. How can you possibly know what the wind is doing 4 kilometers away? Eva didn't answer directly. "Watch the heat haze coming off that shale deposit on Wyvern's Tooth," she instructed. "See how it shimmers? Wait. Now look at the snow being blown off the highest peak. The patterns aren't random. They are all functions of terrain and temperature. They are predictable." Her target was not in the Serpent's Tooth, where Thorne's men were trapped. It was not on Mount Jin, where the sound was coming from. Her scope was pointed at a third location, a desolate, anonymous ridge of shattered rock called the Wyvern's Tooth. There was nothing there, no muzzle flash, no movement. To the naked eye, it was just another stretch of barren rock. "I don't see anything," Davies said, his voice laced with doubt. "You're looking for a person," Eva said, her voice a low murmur, her breathing slowing, becoming shallow and controlled. "Don't. The ghost is an expert. He's using a thermal cloak and a suppressed weapon with a low flash signature. You will not see him. You will not see his rifle." She paused. "But he cannot hide the laws of physics. He is firing a high-velocity projectile. That projectile displaces the air around it, creating a pressure wave. It also has a heat signature from friction. It's a fleeting signal, almost imperceptible, but it's there." What she was looking for was not a sniper. She was looking for his wake. She was hunting for the subtle, momentary distortion his bullet created in the air, a whisper of disturbed heat against the cold rock. And more than that, she was hunting for the one thing he couldn't conceal: the impact of his rifle's recoil on the environment. Even with the best suppressor and recoil absorption, the force had to go somewhere. It went into his body, and from his body into the rock he was lying on. She was looking for a single point on a mountain 4 kilometers away that vibrated with a frequency that did not match the surrounding geology. "There," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible. Her body became utterly still. The rifle seemed to merge with her, becoming an extension of her own nervous system. On her tablet, a single pixel had flickered, a momentary temperature anomaly of less than 1/10 of a degree. It was nothing, a sensor ghost, a bird. But it had appeared in perfect synchronicity with the last report from the ghost's rifle. It was enough. "He's there," she said, "tucked into a crevice just below the main ridgeline. The position offers a perfect view of the serpent's tooth, and it's masked from aerial surveillance by a rock overhang." Davies swung his own scope to the coordinates, she murmured. He saw nothing but rock. "I still don't see him." "You don't have to," Eva replied. Her finger moved to the trigger. "I do." The calculation was now complete. She had accounted for every variable she could measure and modeled the ones she couldn't. The range, 4,157 meters. The bullet, a custom-loaded .408 caliber solid brass projectile weighing 420 grains. The flight time would be nearly 9 seconds. In those 9 seconds, the bullet would travel over 2.5 miles, rising over 150 feet in its parabolic arc before dropping back to Earth. It would be pushed and pulled by wind, gravity, and the turning of the planet itself. It was a shot that defied conventional wisdom, a shot that most ballistics experts would declare impossible. For Eva, it was just math. She exhaled slowly, emptying her lungs. Her heartbeat, which had remained steady, seemed to slow even further, each beat a deliberate, powerful stroke. The world narrowed until it consisted only of the crosshairs in her scope, and the single invisible point in space where she calculated her target would be. The distant sounds of the firefight faded away. The tension in the base dissolved into irrelevance. There was only the problem and its solution. Now. The rifle did not roar. It cracked, a single, sharp, impossibly loud sound that was more like a sonic boom than a gunshot. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, a brutal but expected impact that she absorbed with the practiced ease of a professional. The massive projectile left the barrel at over 3,000 feet per second, a tiny spinning needle of death on a 9-second journey. Silence descended on the FOB. Everyone had heard the shot. It was different from the others, heavier, more profound. They all turned to look at Eva, a lone figure on the perimeter, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel of her strange, futuristic rifle. Davies was frozen, his eye still pressed to his spotting scope, staring at an empty patch of rock 4 kilometers away. 1 second. The bullet crossed the first wind shear, its trajectory minutely altered. 3 seconds. It reached the apex of its arc, high above the valley floor, traveling through the thin, cold air of the inversion layer. 6 seconds. The Earth's rotation had shifted the target. The bullet, maintaining its course in space, was now perfectly aligned with the new position. 8 seconds. It began its terminal descent, gravity pulling it back toward the mountain at an ever-increasing rate. 9 seconds. Davies saw it first. A puff of dust and rock chips, impossibly small at this distance, erupted from the spot he had been staring at. It was not a ricochet. It was an impact, a powerful, explosive transfer of kinetic energy. For a moment, that was all. No confirmation, no sign of a body, just a small, insignificant cloud of dust on a distant mountain. Then, over the still open radio channel from the trapped fire team, a voice, filled with disbelief, cut through the static. "Cease fire! Cease fire! The shooting stopped!" A profound, absolute silence fell over the valley. The oppressive weight that had crushed Fob Sentinel for weeks was gone, lifted in an instant. The ghost was dead. The threat was neutralized. The men in the canyon were safe. They didn't know how. They didn't know why. They only knew that the single, thunderous shot from their own base had been followed by a silence that felt like salvation. Back on the perimeter, Ava was already detaching the bolt from her rifle. Her face showed no sign of triumph, no relief. She was simply resetting her instrument after its use. The problem had been solved. She was moving on to the next phase. Data collection and after-action reporting. She had done her job. The men started to emerge from their cover, their faces a mixture of confusion and awe. They stared at her, this quiet, unassuming woman who had just achieved the impossible. Master Sergeant Thorne, having extricated his team from the canyon, stumbled back into the base a half-hour later, his face streaked with grime and shame. He had lost 2 men. He had failed. And he had heard the shot. He saw his platoon gathered near the perimeter, not looking at him, but at the woman he had publicly humiliated. He knew. In that moment, he knew he had been wrong in a way that would haunt him for the rest of his career. His authority was not just broken, it was shattered, ground into dust by a single, perfectly calculated bullet. Just then, the satellite communications terminal in the command tent chirped to life, a sound no one had heard in weeks. The young lieutenant, his face ashen, ran from the tent. He didn't look at Thorne. He ran directly to Eva. "Corporal," he stammered, his voice filled with a new, profound respect. "The call is for you. It's from CENTCOM, a colonel." Thorne froze. CENTCOM didn't call FOBs in the field. They certainly didn't call for corporals. He watched, his world tilting on its axis, as Ava wiped her hands on a cloth, gave a curt nod, and walked toward the command tent, leaving him alone in the courtyard, surrounded by the silent judgment of his men. The balance of power had not just shifted, it had been completely, irrevocably inverted. Inside the tent, the face of a gray-haired, stern-looking colonel filled the screen. He had the sharp, intelligent eyes of a man who missed nothing. He ignored the lieutenant completely. His gaze was fixed on Ava as she entered. A flicker of what looked like relief crossed his features. "Oracle, are you secure?" he asked, his voice crisp and clear. Ava stood before the screen. "Affirmative, Colonel. Threat neutralized. Asset is secure." The colonel nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. I never had a doubt. We were dark for the last hour. Give me your preliminary after action. Target was utilizing a combination of acoustic misdirection and thermal cloaking, Eva began, her report as precise and emotionless as if she were describing a laboratory experiment. Hostile sniper was positioned at grid 415 7-9341, elevation 3,100 meters. Engaged and neutralized with a single .408 round. Range was 4,157 meters. No collateral damage. Outside the tent, Thorne had crept closer, unable to stay away. He heard the colonel's voice, heard the name Oracle. It was a name whispered in the intelligence community, a legend, a ghost who solved impossible problems. It was not a person, but a designation. He was listening to a myth, and that myth was wearing the uniform of a corporal he had threatened to have court-martialed. The colonel on the screen was looking at something off camera. His expression hardened. I'm getting the field report from the platoon's engagement now, Doctor. It seems Master Sergeant Thorne disregarded your threat assessment. Doctor. The word hit Thorne like a physical blow. The Master Sergeant acted on the intelligence available to him and his own combat experience, Eva replied, her voice giving nothing away. It was a neutral statement of fact, but in its lack of condemnation, it was more damning than any accusation. She was not passing judgment. She was a force of nature. A storm does not judge the house it levels. It simply follows the laws of physics. His experience cost us 2 good men, the colonel said, his voice like ice. He looked directly into the camera, as if he knew Thorne was listening just outside. Lieutenant, find Master Sergeant Thorne. Inform him he is relieved of command, effective immediately. He is to be confined to his quarters. He will not speak to any member of the platoon. He will be on the first transport out of this valley, and he will be facing a board of inquiry. Is that clear? The lieutenant, standing shakily beside Eva, could only manage a choked, "Yes, sir." The colonel's attention returned to Eva, his tone softening almost imperceptibly. Dr. Rostova, your work here is done. We're sending a quiet bird to pick you up at 0400. Pack your instruments. You're needed in the South China Sea. We have a submarine that's gone missing in a rather acoustically complex trench. Understood, Colonel, Eva replied. Rostova out. The screen went blank. Dr. Eva Rostova, a physicist, the Oracle. The revelation settled over the FOB, recontextualizing everything they had witnessed. Her quiet observations, her strange instruments, her focus on rocks and wind. It had not been the eccentricity of a misfit. It had been the methodical work of a genius, operating on a level they could not even begin to comprehend. The hierarchy of rank had been a temporary illusion. Now, the true hierarchy, the one based on pure, undeniable competence, had asserted itself. The atmosphere in FOB Sentinel transformed overnight. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, reverent awe. Thorne was gone, a ghost in his own right, confined to a small room to await his disgrace. The platoon moved with a new purpose, their actions quieter, more deliberate. They had been humbled not by the enemy, but by the sheer, terrifying brilliance of the woman who had saved them. They looked at her not as a corporal, but as something ancient and powerful, a force that had briefly inhabited their world before moving on. They gave her a wide berth, not out of fear, but out of a profound, unspoken respect. They understood that they were not worthy of being in her orbit. Late that night, as Eva was carefully cleaning her rifle, breaking it down into its constituent parts with the care of a watchmaker, Corporal Davies approached her small makeshift workshop. He didn't speak for a long moment. He just stood there, watching her hands move with their impossible precision. Finally, he extended a steaming mug. Coffee, black, no sugar, exactly how she had taken it every morning. It was not an offering of friendship. It was a tribute. She took it without looking up, her focus still on the finely machined bolt of her rifle. She took a sip. Davies cleared his throat, his voice quiet. "Doctor, when you were calculating the shot, you mentioned the Coriolis effect. I understand it in theory from pilot training. But at that range, how do you calculate it so precisely? Does the spin of the bullet itself create its own gyroscopic stability that resists it?" Eva paused in her work. She looked up at him. For the first time, her eyes seemed to register him not as an assistant or a subordinate, but as a student. She saw a genuine curiosity in his face, a desire to understand the rules. "It does," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "It's called the Magnus effect. The spin creates a pressure differential in the air flowing around the projectile. In this case, the right-hand twist of the rifling caused the bullet to drift slightly upward and to the right, a vector that had to be subtracted from the Coriolis calculation and added to the spin drift calculation. It's a tertiary factor, but at 4 kilometers, tertiary factors can mean the difference between a hit and a miss by 20 meters. She picked up a small, polished stone from her table. "The universe doesn't allow for approximations, not when it matters." She turned back to her work, the conversation over. But for Davies, it was a beginning. He stood there for another minute, the complex beauty of the physics she had described settling in his mind. He had been given a glimpse behind the curtain, a look into a world of hidden forces and elegant equations that governed their violent, chaotic lives. He finally nodded, a silent gesture of thanks, and backed away, leaving her to her solitude. At 0400, under the cold, indifferent light of the stars, a black, unmarked helicopter descended toward the base, its rotors beating a quiet rhythm against the mountains. Eva, carrying only a small pack and the long, hardened case for her rifle, walked across the gravel toward it. No one came to see her off. It would have been an intrusion. They simply watched from the shadows, witnesses to her quiet departure. She climbed aboard without a backward glance. The door slid shut, and the helicopter rose into the darkness, disappearing as silently as it had arrived. She was gone. The valley was quiet. The mountains returned to their ancient indifference. But for the men who remained, the world had been reordered. They learned that the loudest voice in the room is often the most ignorant, and that true strength is not measured in stripes on a sleeve, but in the quiet, methodical pursuit of a perfect solution. Eva Rostova left no trace, save for the impossible echo of her rifle, and the enduring lesson that in the calculus of war, the only variable that truly matters is the one who understands all the others.